parliamentary override of constitutional court decisions, which was met with unanimous protest by the legal community, which said that parliamentary override means that the unconstitutional laws can nevertheless be brought back into force. So that the fact that the Constitutional Court found a particular law unconstitutional was seen as a definite and conclusive proof that the law is indeed, in some objective sense, unconstitutional. So in the end, it is worth, perhaps, to restore a certain sense of modesty to the claims of constitutional courts about their supreme insight into constitutional wisdom, and to remind this beautiful maxim made by a great American Justice of Supreme Court, Justice Jackson, who said, although in a different context, not in the context of discussing judicial review, and I'm just paraphrasing here, it is not the case that we are final, meaning having last word, because we are infallible, but rather we are infallible because we are final. And of course, infallible in this maxim meant we really have institutional last word because we have the last word, which, come to think of it, is a nice tautology. Thank you very much.
Sadurski'ye kapsamlı konuşması için teşekkür ediyorum. İkinci konuşmacımız Profesör Doktor Richard S. Kay. Profesör Kay 1974 yılından bu yana Connecticut Üniversitesi Hukuk Fakültesi'nde çalışmaktadır ve halihazırda Wallace Stevens Hukuk Profesörü kadrosuna sahiptir. Lisans diplomasını Brandeis Üniversitesi'nden alan Profesör Kay, Yale Üniversitesi'nde ekonomi alanında master derecesi almıştır. Harvard Hukuk Fakültesi'nden olağanüstü başarı derecesiyle mezun olan Profesör Kay, aynı zamanda Harvard Hukuk Dergisi'nin de editörlüğünü sürdürmüştür. Mezuniyetinden sonra Massachusetts Eyaleti Yüksek Mahkemesi'nde raportör olarak çalışmıştır. Anayasa hukuku, karşılaştırmalı hukuk ve ticaret hukuk alanlarında lisans ve uzmanlık seviyesinde dersler vermektedir. American Cooperative Law Society Derneği'nin sayman üyesi olan Profesör Kay, Uluslararası Karşılaştırmalı Hukuk Akademisi'nde de seçilmiş üye statüsüne sahiptir. Amerikan Hukuk Okulları Derneği'nin Anayasa Hukuku Bölümü eski başkanı olan Kay, Amerika Birleşik Devletleri girişinde pek çok konferansa konuşmacı olarak davet edilmiştir. 2008 yılında 3. baskısı yapılan Avrupa İnsan Hakları Hukuku isimli kitap ile 2500 yılında yayınlanan Anayasal Meseleleri Gündeme Getirmek, Karşılaştırmalı Perspektifler isimli kitapların ko-editörlüğünü üstlenmiştir. Profesör Kay, anayasa hukuku, anayasal teori ve karşılaşma hukuk alanlarında yayınlanmış 50 üstünde makalesi bulunan bir hukuk adamıdır. Şimdi sözü ona bırakıyorum.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so grateful to the organizers of the conference for inviting me here to participate. I mentioned all of them, but especially Professor Ergo, who has worked so hard in taking care of the details of this conference. I'm also grateful because it has given me a chance to tour and travel a little bit. To see a little bit of this beautiful country, which we have been so much impressed with, and even more to learn a little bit about the wit and the kindness and the generosity of the Turkish people, something which my wife and I will treasure for a very long time. My contribution, like my predecessors, is going to be rather general, maybe more than rather general. I'm going to talk about the topic which I'm calling constituent authority, by which I mean the identification of the people or the processes that we regard as capable of creating a legitimate constitution. It's about how to make a proper and accepted constitution. And first I want to distinguish that idea of constituent authority from a more familiar notion, which often goes under the name of constituent power. It's often indeed referred to in its French translation as pouvoir constituant. That's probably because it is associated with the writings of Abbé Sieyès, who published booklets about it in connection with the convening of the Estates General in France in 1789. For Sieyès, the main characteristic of constituent power seemed to be the fact that it was uncontrolled and uncontrollable by any law. Since it is the power that makes the Constitution, and since the Constitution is the sole authority for any other law, it would be illogical for that law to then control the constituent creative power. That invulnerability of the constituent power to any law may explain the sometimes almost frightening terms in which it is sometimes described. Carl Schmitt talked about constituent power as springing out of a normative nothingness and from a concrete disorder. But surely there is something more to say about the nature of a constitution maker, at least something more to say about the nature of a successful constitution. And that is, there must be something about the process of making a constitution that commends itself to the society in which that constitution is going to operate. Someone said that the word authority means will with a reason. And we might say, therefore, that constituent authority is constitutional power with a reason. And it's that reason that interests me in this presentation. It necessarily involves some evaluation of the rightness, the appropriateness of the people or things that made the Constitution. And that evaluation, of course, is not made in a vacuum. That evaluation has to be made in a particular time, in a particular place, by people holding certain values and beliefs. Before talking, however, about what might go into that evaluation, I'd like to go back for a minute to something about both constituent power and constituent authority, and that is the belief that it cannot be legal authority. Because as a matter of fact, lots of constitutions are written by people who claim to be acting under the authority of law. Indeed, you can usually trace a line of legal authority for any instance of constitution making. And let me give you one effectively random example. I could give many, many more. It's the 1978 Constitution of Sri Lanka. It was a pretty total, complete rewriting of the Sri Lankan Constitution. But when it was made law, when it was enacted under the procedures provided for changing the Constitution in the 1972 Constitution of Sri Lanka. Now, that 1972 Constitution and the amending procedures had been enacted by the Parliament of what was then Ceylon under the 1946 Constitution of Ceylon. Although the 72 Parliament that did it had been elected with an advertisement that it was going to write a new constitution. The 1946 Constitution had been promulgated by the King of the United Kingdom in an order in council authorized by a statute of the United Kingdom. So the 1978 Constitution we started with has a very long legal pedigree. Makes it look like you can make constitutions under law. Well, what you might say, well, really, since it was done under the authority of law, it isn't a new constitution at all. It's just a big constitutional amendment. And of course, the difference is not clear-cut. Sometimes very far-reaching changes are made by ordinary constitutional amendment. And I'll give an example to which my colleague has already referred. The 1989 amendments to the Hungarian Constitution were done as amendments to the Constitution. But when the Hungarian Constitutional Court looked at that amended Constitution, it referred to it as something fundamentally different from the old regime. Still, I think there has to be a general feeling that there are limits to what you can do with legal amendments. And here I will refer to what many of you may know, that is the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of India, most prominently in its Kesavananda judgment, in which it held that certain basic features of the Constitution could not be changed even by amendment. And it's that same idea that animates the very common feature of modern constitutions, whereby the constitutional text itself declares certain parts of it to be unamendable. And I needn't tell this audience that the Turkish Constitution has such a before leaving this subject, I would like to note another possible kind of legal authorization of constitution making. And that is those provisions that expressly declare it to be, in a constitution, that declare it to be a constitutional principle or a constitutional right for the people to change the Constitution when they will. And the most famous example of this is probably the 1793 version of the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which says a people has always the right to review, to reform, and to alter its constitution. One generation cannot subject to its law the future generation. And another, a more modern example, also well known, was Article 146 of the German Basic Law, still in effect, anticipating that the Basic Law could itself be replaced by a free expression of the wishes of a reunited Germany. These kinds of provisions, and the possibility of very extensive, if not unlimited, constitutional amendment might lead you to think that indeed it's always possible to abandon one constitution and to establish another under some kind of legal authority. But I don't think so. As we saw when we were talking about the limitations on constitutional amendment, we really have to look at the substance of what's happening, not just the form of the enactment procedure. More particularly, I think what we have to ask is, are the reasons that a new constitutional arrangement is accepted really based on some acceptance of the legal authority of the prior regime? Or is it based instead on political and social factors which are independent of that regime? The Canadian Constitution, current Canadian Constitution, is in form a statute of the United Kingdom Parliament. But the authority of the United Kingdom Parliament, I would submit, is no part of the reason that the Canadian Constitution is law in Canada. And indeed, I would say the authority of the 1946 Communist Hungarian Constitution is really no part of the reason that the current Hungarian constitution is law in Hungary. In cases like this, we have what H.L.A. Hart called a mere relationship of validating purport, which might be useful as a political matter when you're making a new constitution to smooth the way, but is not what makes a constitution binding. Well, what is it then that really can give the force of law to a new constitution if it's not some other law? Well, in our time, you might think that's a pretty easy question. Constitutions can be made only by the people, or we the people. But we need to note, before going on to talk about that this assumption is really just a reflection of prevailing political principles and not an inevitable characteristic of constitutional authority, constituent authority. In some times, in some places, constituent authority might seem more properly vested in a king or in a religious establishment. And we know, as a matter of history, that that has sometimes been the case. But even assuming that we agree that constituent authority belongs only to the people, that is only the beginning of our problems. Because we then need a practical description of how the people goes about making a constitution. Before I do that, I'd like to just say in a sentence what the underlying reasons are that seem to make the people appeal to us as proper constitution makers. I think it's based on a fundamental, very fast, I'm sorry, based on a very fundamental accepted axiom of politics and morality that people ought to be bound only by their own consent. That is the presumption people should be free. It follows from that that people ought only to be coerced by law or by a state existing under a constitution which they themselves have agreed to. And I think we need to keep that underlying justification for the people's constituent authority in mind when we try to figure out just what counts as the people. I want to briefly mention now 4 problems with translating the people as an abstraction into a practical authority that can make constitutions. The first involves identifying the actual human population that qualifies as the people. When we say only the people can make a constitution, that suggests some kind of one-to-one relationship between a constitution and a people. But which of the infinite possible collections of human beings in the world qualify as a people for the purpose of making a particular constitution? This has been the focus of much debate, especially recently, relatively recently, in connection with the possible writing of a European constitution. It's also related to what my colleague talked about a little while ago when he was mentioning the people in the Baltic states recognized in the Constitution. Well, I cannot begin to summarize this literature. It's very vast literature. But I would say it has sometimes been reduced to an opposition between 2 kinds of things that are supposed to define a people. Either some common kinship, language, culture, belief, religious belief that unite them. This is the people as an ethnos, use the Greek term, or in opposition, some shared political, merely some shared political or legal commitments are sometimes said to be sufficient. This is the people as demos. Well, there's a lot to say about this, but let me say one thing. That opposition seems to me to be too stark. That is, it's not an either-or proposition. We know, in fact, from history that we can have successful constitutional states that contain quite different racial, linguistic, ethnic populations. But we also know that those differences may make it harder to sustain a state, and that there are some historical differences, basically irrational differences at bottom, I think, that no constitutional engineering can ever overcome. But this is a question that can never be answered in large categorical terms. It can only be answered in a given time and a given place. Well, let me go on to the second problem in describing the people, and that is how we translate the people into a practical decision-making agent. Because quite obviously, we don't mean, when we say the people make the Constitution, we don't mean all the people make the Constitution. The question reduces, therefore, to what kinds of representation are appropriate for this kind of decision by the people. Now, in fact, the most common constitution makers historically have been legislatures, that is, the ordinary elected legislature. And the legislature certainly is a body in a democratic regime meant to represent the people. But there have been a number of objections raised to this form of constitution making. I very much regret that John Elster, who was supposed to be at this meeting, will be unable to attend because he has written extremely useful and intelligent commentary on this question. But let me mention just two of the problems that have been raised with ordinary legislatures as constitution makers. First of all, when people are choosing a legislature, they may not know that they're also choosing constitution makers. So they cannot direct themselves to the kind of particular fundamental problems that will be at stake when they're making this very important choice of representatives. And the second problem is that members of legislatures, either as individuals or as parts of an institution, may be thought possibly predisposed to increase their own power in designing the Constitution. Therefore, sometimes a society will resort not to the ordinary legislature, but to some special representative body, elected maybe by a special method, and in an election, therefore, in which people can focus on basic constitutional questions. Now, this might be the ordinary legislature, but only one that is elected after an announcement that it is going to draft a new constitution. Or it might be a special ad hoc body, a constituent assembly, a constitutional convention. There are lots of possibilities, of course. In any case, at bottom, we might have some doubts about how different these bodies end up being from the ordinary legislature, at least insofar as they have a claim to speak for the people. I will quote you Noah Webster, the great American essayist and dictionary maker, who wrote in 1787 about constitutional conventions, and he said they are a body of men chosen by the people in the manner they choose the members of the legislature, and commonly composed of the same men, but at any rate they are neither wiser nor better. Finally, I have to note the very and increasingly common use in constitution making of referendum, which we might think to be the most authentic representation of the people. Of course, a referendum can only be the last step in making a constitution. It has to be combined with other techniques. There are also several objections to using the referenda as the representation of the people. For one thing, people in a referenda can say only two things. They can only say yes or no. It's limited. And we need to wonder as well how much even that decision, that process gives rise to the kind of critical, reflective decision-making to which Professor Sidursky referred to, that we think is appropriate for constitution-making, especially in an age of mass modern communication. And we have to remember as well that historically, referenda have been employed by the worst kind of despots. Well, you'll notice I have gone through several possible mechanisms for representing the people in constitution making, and I have found problems with every one of them. Why is that? Well, it's rather clearly because the people isn't a real thing with a real will. We will never have a procedure which will demonstrate the actual consent of all of the people who are governed. The best we can do is find some way of being confident that enough people are sufficiently satisfied. And that, to repeat a theme which I have already mentioned several times and will continue to mention, that depends on the particular time, the particular place, the particular society. The third problem I want to identify with the people as constituent authority is really a manifestation of the same question. And that's the problem of time. We want our constitutions to be authorized by the populations who are subject to it. But we also, again, my colleague has said, for both theoretical and practical reasons, want constitutions to last for a long time. But of course, after some amount of time, it starts to make little sense to think of an existing constitution as approved by the people, at least the people living under it at the later time. Thomas Jefferson thought that no constitution should ever last longer than 19 years, the lifespan of a generation. At some point, the actual people who approve a constitution are all dead. And the dead cannot consent to that constitution for the living. Well, I have no solution to this problem. I suppose in theory, there is some optimal moment when it makes sense to trade off the benefits of a long-term constitution for the legitimacy of one made by a more recent people. But I'm not sure what that time is, although I think it's probably longer than 19 years and shorter than 200 years. Well, the fourth and last problem with the people as constituent authority concerns how accurately, in any form, the idea that the people make a constitution really reflects how constitutions are made. At least if we mean by the people a collectivity composed of individual human beings, the people 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Because in fact, constitutions are often made not by representatives of the people in that sense, but by a group of negotiators representing the people in groups, in clumps, particular interests in society. So naturally, federal states tend to be formed this way. The representatives of the people are not the representatives of the people 1 plus 1 plus 1, they're the representatives of the people grouped geographically. When the Constitution of the German Empire was promulgated in 1870, it's rather hard to call that agreement, the agreement of the representatives of the various principalities, to say that that was somehow the act of the German people, one at a time. Now, this kind of negotiated constitution occurs not just in federal situations, but in other kinds of contexts as well. Often at the end of the Civil War, for example, constitutions arrived at this way. I want to give an outline of one interesting case, and that's that of South Africa. I had hoped that Professor Thomasshausen wouldn't arrive until after I had made my remarks on South Africa, but now I will have to. He will correct me, I have no doubt, when I say is wrong. The 1997 Constitution of South Africa was enacted by a constitutional assembly, and that was indeed an elected body. But the composition and powers of that constituent assembly were defined in a previous constitution. It's called the interim constitution. And the interim constitution put some substantive limits on the kind of constitution that could be created by the Constitutional Assembly. More specifically, any new constitution would have to be certified by the interim constitutional court, it's an interim constitutional court, as consistent with a set of 34 constitutional principles that have been agreed to in the interim constitution. Now, some of these principles were just platitudes, the kinds of things that no one could possibly disagree with. But there were others which were rather controversial matters. And so it really limited the kind of a constitution that could come out of that constitutional assembly, that constitutional assembly. Now, where did that interim constitution come from? It wasn't written by any kind of representative assembly. It was written by a more or less self-selected set of negotiators from racial, tribal, political, geographic, economic interests. Now, I don't mean to say that this was a bad process, given the circumstances, or that the process didn't produce a good constitution for South Africa. I mean, the contrary is true in both cases. But my point is that the underlying bottom authority for that process could never be called the people in a pure 1 + 1 + 1 pristine sense. But then in South Africa, I think something strange happened. People began to talk about the Constitution as if it were the act of an undivided South African we the people. That is, in looking back at the events that created it, some features were emphasized and some were forgotten. So that the constituent authority, as it is now perceived, fits with our ordinary ideas of what a proper, popular constituent authority ought to be. Which brings me to my conclusion. However a given people produces a given constitution, its constituent authority refers to a quality that makes us respect that constitution. So to inquire about the right constituent authority directs us not to the events that created the Constitution themselves, but to subsequent perception of those events. That perception is bound to change over time. That is, we may start to see different facts. We may emphasize certain facts differently. Certainly, we may interpret the significance of facts differently. The constituent authority that underlies the United States Constitution was, in fact, a matter of sharp dispute for the first 75 years of its existence. There were two quite plausible portrayals of how the Constitution of 1787-89 was created. One was that the Constitution was a compact among the states, and that the we the people in the preamble was really we the peoples of the states. The second, also plausible account was that the Constitution was the decision of a single people of the United States. And in fact, a number of practical questions really turned on how you saw the constituent authority. But it was unresolved, and it really took the Civil War to resolve it. So a constitution is not a fixed thing. A constituent authority is not a fixed thing. It is true there are limits to the extent which the constituent authority can change it still needs to be constructed out of the stubborn facts of history. And because constituent authority is an aspect of broadly held social attitudes, ideas about it are likely to change when they change only slowly. But within those limits, we can remake the constituent authority to conform to our current ideas of how to make a good constitution. So American popular depictions of our founding these days tend to emphasize the fact that our founders were devoted to democracy, but they tend to de-emphasize the fact that many of them were also devoted to human slavery. This historic reconstruction, I think, is a general phenomenon. To the extent that any society's constitution seems to be working well, there will be a tendency to see the constituent authority that created it as an admirable constituent authority. So in that sense, paradoxically, we might say that the Constitution creates the constituent authority and not the other way around. Thank you very much. Teşekkür ederim.
Sayın Profesör Doktor K'ye özellikle kurucu yetki, kurucu iktidar konusunda verdiği bilgiler nedeniyle teşekkür ediyorum. Şimdi üçüncü konuşmacımız Profesör Doktor Andre Thomasausen. Andre Thomasausen, Pretoria'da bulunan Güney Afrika Üniversitesi'nde uluslararası hukuk profesördür ve yılda yaklaşık 12.000 öğrencinin sorumluluğunu taşıyarak kamu hukuku, anayasa hukuku ve uluslararası hukuk bölüm başkanlığını yürütmektedir. Aynı zamanda adı geçen üniversite bünyesinde faaliyet gösteren Yabancı ve Karşılaştırmalı Hukuk Enstitüsü'nün başkanlığını da sürdürmektedir. Hukuk doktoru derecesini merhum Profesör Wilhelm Kevenig'in öğrencisi olarak Almanya'nın Kiel kentinde bulunan Christian Albers Üniversitesi'nde üstün başarıyla summa cum laude almıştır. 1951 yılında doğmuş olan Profesör Thomasausen, Almanya'da tanınmış bir uluslararası hukuk avukatı olmanın yanı sıra Almanca, İngilizce, Fransızca ve Portekizce dillerinde yeminli mahkeme tercümanıdır. Mozambik'te Birleşmiş Milletler tarafından sürdürülen barış görüşmeleri UNOMOS çerçevesinde 1992'den 1995 yılına kadar Birleşmiş Milletler Genel Sekreterinin özel temsilcisinin özel danışmanı olarak görev yapmıştır. Profesör Thomasausen'ın özgeçmişine Who's in the World biyografya derlemesinden ulaşılabilir. Sayın Thomasausen, söz sizde.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Professor Gül. It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to be able to be here. Unfortunately, the flight arrangements forced me to arrive this morning, but I did manage to put on a fresh shirt. Let me also express my regrets that I did manage to learn a few languages, but somehow my life never gave me enough opportunity to learn a bit of Turkish. So you will now have to try and follow me through the interpreters. And being one myself, I know that this is a very difficult task, and they don't even have my manuscript. So let us hope that I can get my idea across. I want to speak about constitutional power and legitimacy in the political evolution of Southern Africa. So I want to take you far away to Africa, from where most people would not expect to find much inspiration on constitutional matters. I'm going to divide what I want to say into 4 parts. I'm going to try and very quickly recap a typology of the constitution-making process. Then go into African constitutionalism and what some writers call the virtual constitutions of Africa. And then on power and authority of the constitution. And finally, the future of constitutionalism in Africa. There is agreement that the constitution-making process has a fundamental impact on the future success of a constitution. However, modern reasoning is no longer overly concerned with formal democratic legitimacy. The functions that a constitution-making process is expected to fulfill in a given historical and geographical context stand at the center of our reflections. The function that determines the fate of a constitution mostly is its ability to group and govern diverse peoples so as to give them credible representation, so that they can earn credibility as members of the international system in the context of the inescapable dictates of globalization. In order to be able to achieve these objectives, a constitution must find acceptance and support through the legitimacy of its genesis. The task is thus primarily one of integration through the creation of the state and its organs and institutions. And resulting from this process, one hopes, nation building as part of a process of defining a positive national identity, as opposed to an identity founded on rejection and antagonism towards other identities. The ability to sustain reconstruction, renewal, modernization, and a broad consensus about future aspirations is what decides the welfare of the modern state. Hence, the issue is not the democratic purity of the constitution-making process, but rather the suitability of the chosen process for the task of reviewing or remaking a constitution. Ideally, the choice of the constitution-making procedure will integrate the competing political elites in a country, as well as the main social, economic, cultural, and religious perceptions, in whatever way they may be able to be articulated. In the classic definition of Max Weber, there are three sources of legitimacy: charismatic authority or personalized leadership, rational and institutionalized authority, which in our modern times is brought about and renewed by way of elections, and traditional or historically claimed legitimacy. Historic legitimacy tends to prevail in countries that have undergone some kind of fundamental transformation, such as a liberation from foreign occupation or internal oppression. The victorious liberators will tend to claim a prerogative to govern for at least one, but in Africa, in most countries, more than one generation. Evidently, the three kinds of sources of legitimacy will act in an interdependent manner, and charismatic or personalized legitimacy will play a crucial role in elections, considered to be the generators of rational legitimacy. If we now come to the typology, to a possible typology, I will distinguish 5 ways. The most manipulative and in my opinion, least advantageous process of legitimization of a future constitution is the referendum constitution, where a proposal is elaborated in an exclusionary or elitist process to be submitted to popular approval or rejection in a referendum, subject to subsequent enactment by an existing parliament, as happened with the French Constitution of 1958, the South African Constitution Act of 1983, the last apartheid constitution, or such proposal is submitted to direct enactment by the vote of the electorate in a plebiscite. For example, French Constitution of 1958 or Constitution of Chile of 1980. The intended new Zimbabwean Constitution of 1999, which failed to attain a majority in a referendum, illustrates the risk of the referendum approach. There is consensus that the troubles of Zimbabwe, which by now have all but destroyed the country, are the result of the failure of Zimbabwe's historically legitimized political elite to impose a new constitution by way of a referendum. The second, and maybe democratically most pure process of constitution making is that of the Constituent Assembly Constitution, where a specially convened assembly elaborates and finally enacts a constitution. But this is also the most cumbersome and divisive process. Examples are the American Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia in 1787, the Old French Constitution of 1789, the German Constitution of 1919, and the Portuguese Constitution of 1976. And a small detail on the South African process, it was a parliament that was elected in 1994, except there was a legal fiction that this parliament would also be vested with constituent powers. So it wasn't really a constituent assembly, it was a parliament with constitution-making powers. The third approach is that of the parliamentary constitution, where a new constitution is elaborated and enacted simply by an existing ordinary legislature or legislatures vested ab initio or as a result of a special constitutional amendment with the formal powers, constituent powers to prepare, debate and enact a new constitution. Best known examples are the German Constitution of Frankfurt in 1848, to a degree the West German Grundgesetz of 1949, or most recently the Angolan Constitution of 5 February 2010. The lines between the parliamentary constitution and that what is referred to as an imposed constitution, oktroyierte Verfassung in the German terminology, can be blurred, depending on the degree of indirectness of parliamentary representation and the actual parliamentary process followed in the making of the constitution. Purely imposed constitutions are constitutional texts that come into force simply by order or enactment of a government or a foreign sovereign who has the power of so doing, without formal involvement of the electorate or any elected representation. Illustrations are the Portuguese Constitution of 1933, the Spanish Constitution of 1945, the South African Constitution of 1909, the Japanese Constitution of 1946, or the important Constitution of Zimbabwe of 1979, which was enacted by an order in council, as it is called, of the British government. The greatest number of modern constitutions, especially in Africa, can be grouped in a last and fifth category that I call the pact constitutions, meaning constitutions that come about as the result of a